Alright. The depiction of Stalin between history and mythology. The various historical sources in the current depiction of Stalin. Alright, let's do that.
7. The depiction of Stalin between history and mythology. The various historical sources in the current depiction of Stalin. However, it's difficult for the current historiography to distance itself from the depiction of Stalin as an enormous, shadowy, capricious, and degenerate monster of man in addition. So lacking in intellectual and political capacity that he becomes the object of ridicule. With regard to mythology, it's also necessary to search for its historical origin. It's worthwhile to start with the author, Deutscher, who was just cited, who in other circumstances and in a different period of time observes, in contrast to the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks don't execute their Girondins, namely, the Mensheviks, who were permitted and even encouraged to leave Russia and set up their political center abroad. 894. From there a harsh campaign is developed against the country, first led by Lenin and later, for a longer period of time, by Stalin. Deutscher continues as follows. It's correct that Stalin meditated. It's correct that Stalin meditated at length about the terrible French precedent and for a few years that dissuaded him from resorting to more drastic means of repression. More than once Stalin had expressed himself in that sense. In 1929, he decided to exile Trotsky from Russia. One couldn't yet imagine that Trotsky was to be captured, and much less put before an execution squad. 895. With the opposition leader's arrival in Istanbul, a new and more committed political center is formed, this time dedicated exclusively to exposing and denouncing all aspects of Stalin's personality and actions. Fugitives like General Orlov can be put in that same context, fugitives who, in reaching the West, dedicate themselves to revealing the Kremlin's secrets, earning an enormous amount of money, and presumably it's a sum that's greater for however much more sensational the revealed secrets are. Beginning with the Gorbachev years, these revelations are eagerly welcomed in the Soviet Union and are still today one of the most important sources for Western Sovietology. These revelations, however, are a web of lies. 896. Obviously, we must not overlook the fact that the anti-Stalin campaign has its political center in the West. Its motivations had been previously clarified by Lloyd George, who, in the summer of 1919, observed that a united Russia, whether Bolshevik or not, constituted a threat to the British Empire. 897. In other words, a wide part of public opinion, first British and later American, identify Stalin as the incarnation of a double threat, that represented communist agitation in the capitalist metropole, and especially in the colonies. And that represented a great power, now all the more dangerous and expansionist for the fact it inspires and leads a political movement represented in all parts of the world.
Alright,
Which of the different political centers was the most implacable? At times, we get the impression that we are watching a competition. Soon after the Pact of Non-Aggression between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, Trotsky lets out a type of victory cry. Finally, it's now evident to even the professional apologists for the Kremlin and Stalin. The pro-Soviet fools of all types, those who had the illusion of being able to count on Moscow's support in containing Nazi Germany's expansion. Neville Chamberlain is especially targeted. Yes, the British Prime Minister, who by this time is denounced by Churchill for his policy of appeasement pursued in relation to Hitler, is sharply criticized by Trotsky for having fed illusions toward Stalin. Despite all his aversions toward the Soviet regime, the British conservative leader had tried to make an alliance with Stalin using all means, a colossal example of naivety. Trotsky had repeatedly stated since the rise of the Third Reich that despite all the rhetoric about the anti-fascist popular fronts, the real objective of Stalin's foreign policy was to reach a deal with Hitler.
wait, what?
Now all are forced to recognize that the Kremlin dictator is Hitler's butler. 898.
Wait. Thus, her delusion of being able to count on Moscow supporting and containing Nazi Germany's expansion. That would especially targeted. It's saying, trying to say trying to say Trotsky was saying that Trotsky was trying to say that Neville Chamberlain was trying to make a deal with Stalin. Kind of. So then it's the idea that only Churchill was trying to push. Was only Churchill the leader of the UK trying to push Germany eastward? But yeah, that part makes sense. About Trotsky calling Stalin Hitler's butler.
This competition, seriously weakened by the epic resistance by the Soviet Union against the Third Reich, returns in force after the 20th Congress of the CPSU and the secret report. So Khrushchev accused Stalin of having deviated from Lenin? In fact, Orlov immediately increased the dose, publishing an article that in its very title announces a sensational secret: the man who led the Soviet Union for 30 years was a secret police agent for the Tsarist regime.
What?
Obviously prepared to liquidate the unlucky souls who learn of his unspeakable past. Still today, a Russian researcher, Rogowan, a zealous follower of Trotsky's, appears to cling to that revelation. 819.
Wait, what? So some other guy trying to say Stalin was a secret agent for the Tsarists. Who the fuck is Orlov? Because well, that sounds just silly. Uh, 8.99, but I can't see that. Well, that's wonderful. And of course, because some stuff happened, that other thing died on me. Alright. Wait, what? Yeah, that's fine.
The competition can take on the most unique forms. In 1965, Deutscher reflects on the evolution by the Menshevik leader Dan, who patriotically blinded by the image of a Russia triumphantly emerging from a catastrophic war. With the Third Reich prostrated before it, ended up recognizing the historical correctness of the October Revolution, but also, unfortunately, the correctness of Stalinism, with all its ideological perversions and violence. There's only one excuse for that tolerance toward a degenerated end. Corrupted Bolshevism. The fact that when Dan wrote some of these pages, the pro-Stalinist tide in the Allied countries was very strong, especially during the immediate post-war period in the United States. 900 Fortunately, the information coming from the very capital of the Soviet Union, and from within that country's very own Communist Party, refuted and ridiculed once and for all the naive and ill-informed who had in some way or another consumed Moscow's propaganda. Only through this convergence of heterogeneous interests can one explain the paradox of a historiography that, while unceasingly denouncing the farcical nature of the trials carried out by Stalin in Moscow, has easily accepted the legitimacy of the trial conducted in different manners, first by Trotsky and later by Khrushchev.
Periodic changes in the depiction of Stalin.
The periodic changes in the depiction of Stalin. The depiction of the enormous, shadowy, capricious, and degenerate monster of man is so widespread nowadays that we forget the contradictory history that preceded the rise of that image. We saw the acknowledgments directed at Stalin by illustrious statesmen, diplomats, and intellectuals. The pages of his 30 years in government, today simply considered horrific, were in the past read very differently. Nowadays it's commonplace to identify the revolution from above, that radically changed the face of agricultural in the Soviet Union, as an exclusive product of ideological madness. But in 1944, even while revealing its terrible human costs, de Gasperi nevertheless expresses a fundamentally positive judgment on the great economic enterprise of collectivization of the countryside and industrialization. Having been made necessary by the danger of war and by the threat revealed in Mein Kampf 901. Nowadays, very few would dare question the thesis according to which the bloody and large-scale repression realized by Stalin had been the exclusive product of his libido dominandi or his paranoia. However, between the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, Malaparte had calmly spoken of the preparations for a coup d'état in Moscow and Stalin's hesitation in counterattacking, ch. An authoritative German press organization went even further, and mocked the naivety demonstrated by the Kremlin dictator in not sending Trotsky and his crew to the beyond. 902 Around 20 years after the fact, Churchill himself at least indirectly evaluated the trials against Tkaikevsky and the other military leaders. It was a question of a cruel, but perhaps not pointless, military political purge that had eliminated all the pro-German elements, and, to a certain degree, that's true even for the Moscow trials. On the bench of the accused were seated Soviet leaders full of jealousy toward Stalin who had ousted them. 903 The stance by the British statesman, champion of the struggle until the end against Hitler's Germany, is yet more significant because it's formulated in a polemic against Chamberlain, the protagonist of the policy of appeasement. More radical or more explicit was the American ambassador to the USSR, Joseph Davies, who continued to insist that there really was a conspiracy, that the trials were carried out according to the law, and that consequently Soviet authority had been strengthened by it. 904 In 1944, de Gasperi also stressed that the veracity of the charges directed at the anti-Stalin opposition was confirmed by objective American intelligence. 905. Then there was a radical change, but the weakness and the inconsistency of the image of Stalin given to us first by the Cold War and then by the secret report begin to emerge from the research by a growing number of scholars. In some ways one witnesses an evident turnaround. Let's take the Great Terror. Alongside the other leading political figures we've already encountered, even a fervent admirer of Trotsky's, namely Deutscher, in 1948 thinks the Moscow trials are more or less credible. In his opinion, Kirov's assassination was in no way staged by the regime. The long tradition in Russia that dared to attack the autocracy with bombs and pistols had returned to influence the young communists. Was not Lenin's brother, by chance, among the conspirators who had tried to kill Alexander III? The textbooks depict those martyrs and those heroes with a romantic halo. That's how the sacred shadows of the past now reappear to arm the more impatient anti-Stalinist Komsomols. The ideas of revolutionary terrorism had expanded to the point of constituting a state of mind widespread among the youths and arming the hand of Kirov's assassin. 906. Still in 1949, Deutscher recognized certain psychological truth in the Moscow trials in general, and also a factual truth with regard to the execution of Tkaikevsky in particular. Regarding the latter event, while certain sources speak of a setup by the Nazi intelligence services, numerous anti-Stalinist sources argue, however, that the generals had in fact plotted a coup d'état. 907 In either case, Stalin's paranoia or his libido dominandi wouldn't play any role. It must
Alright, Hmm.
It must be added that a few years later, an American historian unmoved by the revelations of the secret report and who continued to have sympathy for the anti-Stalinist opposition, defined by him as the consciousness of the revolution, wrote, "What Bukharin stated in his guilty confession, and what's known from other sources, makes a good part of what was revealed in the trial appear plausible, despite the suspicions provoked by the nature of those trials." 908. Nowadays it's the very scholars of Trotskyist orientation who are calling attention to the civil war unleashed within the Soviet leadership and demanding the opposition's recognition for having promoted by all means the overthrow of the Thermidorian regime imposed by the traitors of the revolution. It's significant that this turn also affects Trotsky's group of followers, who in their time had dedicated themselves, more than anyone else, to denouncing the
Alright, what was that? Calling attention to the civil war unleashed within Soviet leadership and demanding the. Alright.
With regard to the leadership of the USSR, both on the eve and during the Second World War, Deutscher's evolution is particularly tortured and remarkable. We already came across his quite flattering portrait in 1948 of Stalin as a war leader, Supra, Intro, 1. In 1956, writing in the immediate wake of the secret report, without much trouble Deutscher believes the revelations. According to which in the days following the start of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin had retreated in paralysis to his dacha, unresponsive and angry, only to later, giving in to the demands and pleas from his colleagues, return to lead the country and to conduct a war by drawing fronts and lines attack on a globe. The only criticism Deutscher offers to Khrushchev and his circle is that they hadn't followed the recommendations already put forth by Trotsky in 1927, in other words, of not having understood the duty of toppling Stalin. In order to conduct the war in a more efficient way and guarantee its final victory, 909 10 years later, returning to this subject, Deutscher writes, "I'm not willing to accept the so-called Khrushchev revelations without reservations." Particularly his statement that during World War II and the victory over the Third Reich Stalin had only played a practically insignificant part.
What? Oh, yeah. Revelations, that would be what Khrushchev wrote. That was a bit of a mess.
910 It must be said that more recent historical research goes further than this partial and timid reconsideration. Regarding the thesis of the oppressed nations, we've already encountered the radical and positive innovation of affirmative action put into practice in the USSR to the benefit of national minorities, Supra, ch. But now it's worthwhile to read the evaluation recently made by another American historian. A new consensus is emerging, on the basis that, far from being the killer of nations familiar to Western history and the history of nationalism, the Soviet government takes on an ambitious, complex, and prolonged effort to construct ethnically defined nations within a unified state at the political and economic level. With the aim of encouraging this springtime of Soviet nations, the Soviet state conceded juridical and political equality with Russians to the peoples of the former empire. On these new national territories it reserved a privileged place for the languages of the national minorities, even when the Soviet ethnographers had to create an alphabet for local dialects, because they had never taken on a written form. That policy of promoting an autonomous national culture went as far as trying to assimilate Russians. Soviet government employees and administrators had to learn the languages of the nations where they worked. 911. A French historian on Central Asia, Olivier Roy, comes to the same conclusions. Favorably cited in an essay published in the New York Review of Books, he summarizes the current outlook on that region as follows: "They are solid and functional states that can assert themselves if they know how to intelligently take advantage of their Soviet inheritance. The crafters of Moscow's national policy codified languages, sometimes creating new alphabets for them, built national parliaments, national libraries, and instituted a policy of affirmative action in favor of local cadre. It was primarily and especially Stalin who stood out among the protagonists of this enlightened policy. How far we are from the Cold War thesis formulated by Arendt, according to which Stalin had deliberately disorganized and disarticulated nationalities with the aim of creating conditions favorable for the triumph of totalitarianism. An author, who was earlier a leader of the anti-Soviet dissidents, states his admiration for the Soviet Union, and Stalin, for its national policy in the following emphatic terms: in the decades of Soviet rule, and in its solution to the national question, the positive elements were so numerous that it's difficult to find a comparable example in the history of humanity. 912.
Huh. Alright. Hey, what up, Pinko? Thanks for the follow. I feel like my mind told me to scroll up, but I don't remember why it told me to scroll up. So fuck it.
Overall, the caricature of Stalin made first by Trotsky and later by Khrushchev no longer enjoys much credibility. From the
Natural reader reading, Dominic Losudo. No, wait. I think I always want to put an R in his name where it doesn't go. So let me just. Dominic Losudo. I always want to put an R where the in between the O and the S, but there's no R there. His book on Stalin, it's a bit of a mess. I think part of the reason it's a bit of a mess, and part of the reason is because it's not a straight English translation. It's now if you want a more interesting one by him, there was one called Liberalism: A Counter History. Now that was pretty interesting. Starts off with the question of was it what is liberalism, and talking about was it the 1700s, how you'd have one group that would call themselves liberal, but they weren't really. What was it? Basically, the two sides in the 1700s, there were like one that was for the slave trade and one that was more for industrialization. It's like, which one of these would you call liberal? There was just some good points. It was more so just continuously asking philosophical questions, and it was very, very good and interesting. This one's been a bit of a mess. Anyway, alright, what was this at? Caricature. Alright.
Overall, the caricature of Stalin made first by Trotsky and later by Khrushchev no longer enjoys much credibility. From the present-day research by eminent scholars, beyond suspect of having indulged in the cult of personality, emerges the portrait of a politician who rises and secures the positions of power in the USSR primarily for the fact that he widely surpasses his competitors. When it comes to understanding how the Soviet system operated, 913 a leader of exceptional political talent and enormously gifted, 914 a statesman who saved the Russian nation from annihilation and enslavement, thanks not only to his astute military strategy, but also his masterful wartime speeches, speeches that are at times authentically brilliant, that in tragic or decisive moments manage to encourage national resistance. 915 a figure who doesn't lack qualities when it comes to theory, as demonstrated by the insight with which he dealt with the national question in his writings from 1913, and the positive effect of his contribution to the linguistic question, among others. 916. Certainly, they rightly stress at the same time that this recognition is not an absolute moral judgment. However, the secret report's complete lack of credibility is by now clear. There's not a detail in it that's not contested today. Take the report of Stalin's supposed psychological collapse in the days immediately following the start of Operation Barbarossa, according to the analysis we've already seen from two Russian historians, of anti-Stalinist orientation, of course. It's an episode that is totally invented, supra, ch. 2, and that a French historian insists is in complete contradiction with the testimony and documentation that increasingly comes to light. 917 But it's not a question of a single episode, however significant it may be. Also with regard to the so-called doctor's plot, Khrushchev crudely and deliberately distorted the truth. 918 Yes, he took great liberty with the truth. 919 This observation made this time by a British historian previously cited, regarding Stalin's wartime leadership is generally useful. To get to the truth, it's necessary to look beyond the Western polemics of the Cold War, as well as the circumstances of de-Stalinization in the USSR. 9
Alright. I feel like that's missing that third object of the truth that even inventing reality would bring up, or manufacturing consent. So basically, Herman or Parenti would bring up when, yeah, the Western polemics and de-Stalinization would be saying one thing, but that doesn't always mean that the USSR state would always be doing the right thing, even when Stalin was in charge. Probably better than the West, but gotta have that critical eye of everything. Actually, now that I think about it, it reminds me of hearing about the movie documentary on propaganda or something, but it used North Korea as a backdrop instead. Wasn't really negative about them, but apparently it played a balance. I should actually watch that. Heard about it most recently from a video Bad Mouse put out the past few weeks. It was pretty good. It was just titled Tankies, but he was going after both those who just used the word just freely, and then anyone that just on their side just like fuck it, just goes by that word unironically, when that is a problem, because you want to be critical of everything. Contradictory motives behind Stalin's demonization.
Contradictory motives behind Stalin's demonization. Arendt's thesis that for a long time had been undisputed in the West and uncritically repeated time and again that sought to prove the unbreakable attraction, in spite of everything, between communist totalitarianism and Nazi totalitarianism. Using these words, the only man for whom Hitler has unconditional respect was the brilliant Stalin. Moreover, we know from Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Party Congress that Stalin trusted in only one man, which was Hitler.
What?
It is so evident that, despite all the warnings, he refused to believe that Hitler had broken the treaty until the very end. To confirm this, Arendt again cites the secret report, or to be more precise, the version of Khrushchev's speech provided by the American State Department 921. Against that affirmation, which was based on an evidence.
That just sounds silly to believe that. That he would have any kind of trust in Hitler like that. Even if you hated Stalin, that just. He was shrewd enough to use alliances and whatnot with people to be the one that took power after Lenin's death. To it makes no sense for that kind of person to then be blinded when it comes to war breaking out with Barbarossa. That's just silly.
Against that affirmation, which was based on an evidently politicized speech that was certainly not concerned with historical rigor, one could counter with the well-documented analysis according to which in post-World War II Hungary and Eastern Europe, Stalin only trusted in Jewish cadre, who are in fact called upon to construct the framework for a new state apparatus, supra, ch. As one can see, the antithesis with respect to Hitler couldn't be more clear. But let's dwell on the fragility of the ideological theme treasured by Arendt and ruling ideology. Recently a reversal of positions has been witnessed. A few years ago, authoritative and ideologically relentless anti-communist scholars insisted on depicting Stalin as an insatiable expansionist, ready at the opportune moment to attack Germany itself, with whom it maintains a pact of non-aggression. To make that...
Wait, really? As expansionist? I could see the post years maybe more than those years. They were really just rebuilding after World War One. Wow.
To make that case, they specifically cited Stalin's speech to the military academy graduates. In order to be brief, I'll cite the summary found in Dmitrov's diary: our peace and security policy is at the same time a policy in preparation for war. There's no defense without offense. It's necessary to prepare for war. 922. It's May 5 of 1941, the same day that Stalin meets personally with the highest officials of the party and state, in evident preparation for open battle with the Third Reich. The substantial development of Soviet military industry had been promoted by Stalin in preparation for an offensive war, against which Hitler sought to defend. 923. That thesis, incessantly pushed by historical revisionism, can be easily refuted by referring to something cited by an author who is among the most prominent members of that historical and ideological current, by the beginning of May, 1941. General Antonescu, who will end up taking power in Romania, informs his German allies that the factories around Moscow had received the order to relocate their machinery to the country's interior. 924. Moreover, the Nazis were desperately looking for a casus belli. The spy chief, Admiral Canaris, writes in his diary, General Jodl informed me that they are very concerned by the unusual and forgiving Soviet behavior in relation to us, and, partly joking, added, if those individuals, the Soviets, continue to be so accommodating and letting everything go, it will have to be you who organizes an incident that starts the war. 925. Debunking revisionist historians' latest weapon of argument, This testimony unequivocally proves who is the aggressor. Secondly, it clarifies that it was Stalin's very own behavior, condemned by Khrushchev, that made the Third Reich nervous. The new accusation against Stalin found its immediate consecration in the mass media that, with the aim of giving it more credibility, didn't hesitate to bring up the speech from August 19, 1939. A prominent Sovietologist commenting with righteous indignation, while he prepared to send the loyal Molotov to Berlin to finish the non-aggression pact, Stalin had already elaborated, with repugnant cynicism. A plan for aggression and Sovietization of all of Europe, including Germany, at the opportune moment. 926 In reality, this is a serious historical falsehood, supra, ch. But that isn't the important point. The revelation of this new treacherous act by Stalin could have been the moment to reconsider the thesis developed by Arendt, with credit also to Khrushchev's report about the close relationship between the two highest incarnations of totalitarianism. But none of that took place.
What? Wish I could check that 926 footnote, but I know the footnotes at the end of this are actually broken. That actually would be interesting to read where that comes from. The footnote for a plan for aggression and Sovietization of all of Europe, including Germany, at the opportune moment. Yeah, I don't think so, but it still would be interesting to read. Yeah.
Historians on the concentrationary universe rightly denounce the subsequent severity experienced in the Gulag and the super-exploitation of the prisoners. That reaches its horrible apex after the breakneck growth of the economic plans of 1940 to 1941, therefore, during the time of the Non-Aggression Pact, when Soviet leadership, in preparation for war, ignore any other consideration in accelerating to the maximum the completion of plans of great strategic and economic importance like, for example, the construction of airports, aircraft factories, and industries essential for the war effort. 927 In light of this, the commonplace accusation made by Arendt becomes ever more grotesque, and yet it continues to be obsessively repeated. It's necessary to always prove that Stalin had blind trust in Hitler. The ruling ideology, therefore, easily makes use of the most contradictory statements and accusations. What matters is that they are defamatory. The tendency to drift from history and into political mythology is clear. The obligation to demonize, for whatever motive, manifests itself in other fields. Nowadays the black legend of Stalin's anti-Semitism is unchallenged. But we're not without a perspective that's diametrically opposed. There's the research by a journalist, an American Jew, who speaks of Stalin's fondness toward Jews, to whom he entrusts the management of the concentration camps where the Germans destined to be expelled from Poland are held. Thus, those who survived the final solution can avenge themselves in a terrible way and become the executioners of their executioners, all thanks to the Soviet dictator's cunning and perfidy. 928 He is also accused in a book by an author closely associated with the military of the German Federal Republic of having circulated war propaganda about gas chambers and the plan for the total extermination of the Jewish population by the Third Reich, with the aim of discrediting their enemies. 929 It's evidently in total contrast to the understanding of Stalin as an anti-Semite which is still widely accepted.
I mean, yeah, I think in an earlier chapter it was talking about accusing the USSR Stalin of anti-Semitism, but also noting that there was what was it? A lot of Jewish and did it say, I think it said leadership positions. Of course, that was probably also used in propaganda by the fascists to say, "Oh yeah, what we were saying about the Judeo-Bolshevism, that's our proof right there." Probably. All right.
Finally, it's also worthwhile to observe how the subject of Stalin's paranoia was often handled in a contradictory way. One historian, who stands out for making that diagnosis, nevertheless stresses the role Beria was to have in the Soviet leader's death. 930 Certainly, one could say he had ended up being a victim of a climate he himself created. The fact would remain that, at least starting from a certain moment, the threat was real and no longer the product of a sickness-induced fantasy. In addition, those who accused Stalin of being paranoid are sometimes figures and authors who, without providing any proof, claim he is responsible for the death of his closest collaborators, like Kirov and Zhdanov. Do they not resort here to the same attitude for which they condemn the dictator? But those questions and those problems aren't even raised. What's important is to highlight, in any way possible, the infamy of the communist and Oriental despot.
Wait, what? Kurov? Isn't he the one that got assassinated, which then led to Stalin during the purges or whatever? So he was responsible for his death, but also his death was used in what is effectively a second civil war to get rid of any kind of Trotskyists or opposition in the country. Political struggle and mythology between the French Revolution and the October Revolution.
Political struggle and mythology between the French Revolution and the October Revolution. In June of 1956, under the impression made by just having read the Khrushchev report, Deutscher observes, communists had for more than a quarter of a century bowed before a monstrous tyrant, vile at both the moral and intellectual level. How could all of this have happened? 931 Following that line of argument, he could have added, what had led illustrious Western philosophers and statesmen to pay tribute to that monster with approving and respectful statements and, in certain cases, even admiration. These questions are legitimate and even inevitable, but maybe they should be complemented by another. How could Deutscher have allowed himself to be affected by that behavior which he sharply condemned in 1956? Yes, after the end of World War II and on the occasion of Stalin's death, he would pay tribute to the statesman who had made a decisive contribution to the defeat of the Third Reich and had built socialism in the USSR. In that period, the abject and idiotic monster had not yet entered the scene, and therefore the doubts had not yet emerged over the enormous credit that he enjoyed, despite everything, for a long time. Maybe in 1956, Deutscher would have had a better response if he had asked a very different question, led by a generalissimo and by such a ridiculous political leader. How was the Soviet Union able to defeat the terrible Nazi war machine that had so quickly subjugated the rest of continental Europe? And how was the Soviet Union, starting from a position of extreme weakness, able to turn into a military and industrial superpower? Yes, looking closely, with half a century of distance from Stalin's death and the clamor of de-Stalinization, it's opportune to return to the question made by Deutscher to radically invert it. How did such a grotesque and absurd portrait like the one made by Khrushchev achieve the status of historiographical and political dogma? That dogma was even infused with new details, increasingly fantastical, following the revelations of the secret report that attributed to Stalin a blind confidence in Hitler's respect for the Non-Aggression Pact. Arendt, in the subsequent editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism, put together a theorem of the elective affinity between the two dictators, and that theorem identified an increasing number of points of contact and symmetries. Until the two monsters become perfect equivalents in all aspects of their political action and ideology, including the consummation of a Holocaust and anti-Semitic hatred.
uh,
The key to explaining that unique phenomenon can be found in the history of political mythologies. After Thermidor, the Jacobins are also put to the guillotine at the moral level. They become those sultans, those satyrs, who had nearly everywhere created places of pleasure and places for orgies in which they gave into all excesses. 932 In addition to sexual libido, what especially consumed Robespierre was libido dominandi. He was preparing to get married to Capet's daughter in order to ascend to the throne of France. 933 The accusation was undoubtedly sensational, but there was no lack of proof, they were even abundant, the marriage certificate had already been signed, moreover. In the house of the recently executed tyrant were found a seal with the symbol of France and the dynastic seal of the House of Bourbon. 934 The execution or the murder of Louis XVI can now be seen in new light. The man responsible for that act had perhaps only intended to rid himself of a rival, he wanted to eliminate the obstacle that prevented him from ascending to the throne. The moral decapitation of Robespierre was linked to the more specifically intellectual decapitation. During the Jacobin period, popular episodes not promoted from above of vandalism and revolutionary iconoclasm take place that targeted the symbols of the old regime. Such episodes continued to arise during Thermidor, this time having in mind everything that recalled the terror. But the new rulers accused the Jacobins of the following: out of hatred for the culture they were totally deprived of, they had planned to burn libraries, and they had already put that crazy plan into action. Over the course of various passages, the list of accusations grows ever larger and becomes an ever more uncontroversial fact to the degree it loses all contact with reality. Boissy d'Anglas can subject the Jacobins to public derision by affirming, without a doubt, these ferocious enemies of humanity would have momentarily shown their villainy only under the light of the libraries burned, since they hoped that the darkness of ignorance would extend even further. Barbarians. They have set the human spirit back many centuries. 935. The Jacobins had introduced mandatory schooling, and against them and against. The Jacobins had introduced mandatory schooling, and against them and against the French Revolution itself the counter-revolutionary propaganda did not tire in denouncing the hubris of reason, and on the contrary celebrating the beneficial function of prejudice. But in the ideological and political atmosphere of Thermidor, Robespierre and his collaborators are accused of having sought to spread the darkness of ignorance. And the new accusation is made without even reconsidering the previous accusation. Logical coherence is the last of their concerns. Also with regard to the terror's number of victims, one witnesses a process similar to that which was just seen with the libraries. Again we turn to the words of the eminent scholar that we continue to follow here: the numbers are not up for discussion, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, they even speak of millions. In summary, it's a matter of genocide, as denounced by the Jeunesse Dorée in their anti-Marseillaise anthem against the drinkers of the blood of humanity, that anthropophagic horde, those terrible cannibals. 936 It's an accusation taken up and radicalized by the left. Soon after Thermidor, Babeuf speaks of a process of depopulation carried out in the Vendée by Robespierre, who goes as far as to pursue the infamous, unprecedented political objective of wiping out the human race. 937 That is how we witness a convergence between the extreme right and the extreme left of the political spectrum, both agreeing to depict Robespierre as a genocidal monster. However, that paradox doesn't last long. It doesn't take Babeuf long to get to the real meaning of Thermidor, before the judges that were prepared to condemn him to death, in denouncing the desperate situation to which the popular masses are condemned. He appeals to Saint Just and his ideals for everyone's happiness and salvation from misery. On the other hand, he expresses his disdain for the system of hunger put into practice by the new rulers and classifies the Thermidorian Boissy d'Angles as genocidal, populicide. That is how the charge of genocide undergoes a radical reversal. It no longer targets Robespierre, but his victorious enemies.
The what? Uh, Denouncing the desperate situation to which the power masses are condemned. He appeals as deals for everyone's happiness, salvation from misery, and expresses his disdain for the system of hunger put into. So trying to charge the new ruling power genocidal for wanting to punish Robespierre for his actions. Which were in itself genocidal. That's an interesting argument. I'm not sure who that is being said that made that argument in defense of Robespierre, but I don't think I've noticed that an argument for Robespierre. Although, I guess there is a similar argument in contemporary culture where you want or the idea of you don't want to do the do something someone else did because they're bad. It's more, or to put it another way, it's not about us doing something bad, but using power itself, almost like the original person did, not using power in a bad way, but using power to punish bad people for them doing bad things. By calling that like authoritarian or Malcolm, Machiavellian or something like that. I can't. I don't have any specific examples that immediately come to mind, but there is just a general sense of not wanting to use power, just being afraid to use it. It's not always saying that that action would be bad, but just the idea of, or it's not that the action would be good or bad, it's just the idea of using it. itself is bad. The idea of thinking about it is bad. Just weird. You can you can support using power to go after bad people, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You can also be afraid of going too far like bad people. But yeah, it's probably more like a balancing act that you always got to be aware of. Although that sounds very interest of me, so which makes me not want to like saying that. uh,
It would be interesting to make a comparative analysis of the mythologies that arise from the Great Revolutions. After October 1917, the Jacobin drinkers of human blood are substituted by the Bolsheviks who, according to refugees in the US from Soviet Russia, had invented and frantically used an electric guillotine capable of killing 500 men per hour. We saw the Jacobins branded as people who frequented places of pleasure and organized orgies. In October of 1919, the Hungarian communist leader, Bela Kun, is accused of having established a harem with a lavish assortment of women, where the perfidious and insatiable Jew could rape and dishonor dozens of virgins of the Christian caste. 900.
whoa, 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 whoa. All right, so you can. Now that sounded bad. It got worse, and it got to part where worse in the fact that okay, I'm not uh, sure that that's not complete bullshit. As soon as it had that anti-Semitism in there, the insatiable Jew could uh, do these bad things. Oh shit, man! Who actually said that? Cause man, shit's not good.
938. Repeating this slander is a newspaper that will later become the official press organ for the Nazi Party, but at that time, in expressing its horror over the events in Eastern Europe, shares an outlook that's widespread in Western public opinion and on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, too, the Bolsheviks are synonymous with debauchery and moral depravity. In Russia they had introduced the nationalization of women. As charged by documents published with the authorization of President Wilson and as was described in rich detail by an authoritative newspaper like the New York Times, yes. Every girl upon turning 18 years old is forced to register in an office of free love, and then sadly turned over to a man arbitrarily chosen, and she is forced to suffer on her body and soul the governmental entity's impositions. 939.
What? That just sounds silly. Actually, that sounds more like what happens in the U.S. What with uh, I mean, was it with marriage? Uh, always having to have the man give the daughter away.
If the Jacobins are barbarians, even more so are the protagonists of the October Revolution, first classified as agents of Imperial Germany, or the Huns and the Vandals, as Germans are defined by Entente propaganda during World War I, and later as the agents of Jewish internationalism, even more alien to true civilization, both for their geographic origin, as well as the support provided to the colonial revolts and to the peoples of color, just as Nazi propaganda insisted on repeating. Finally, While Robespierre is for some time accused by Babeuf of having wanted to completely wipe out the human race, Conquest is satisfied in blaming Stalin for organizing the starvation of the Ukrainian people. The topics sketched out here are only modest suggestions for the future historian. In looking for the appropriate comparison for these political mythologies, it's worthwhile, at any rate, to observe that Stalin was less fortunate than Robespierre. Yes, in Russia today there are popular demonstrations that raise his portrait. And the majority of adults have a positive view towards Stalin and see in him the energetic leader the country needed in such calamitous times. Among the ex-dissidents we see Alexander Zinoviev classify Yeltsin as the leader of a criminal counter-revolution in a colonial democracy, and he makes a surprising overall evaluation of the history of the Soviet Union. Including the 3 decades of the Stalin era, thanks precisely to communism, Russia was able to avoid even greater evils and to realize, in extremely difficult historical circumstances, advancements that only a cynical rabble can deny. 940 in the West, however, including on the left, the charge of Stalinism can hit anyone who even dares to express any doubts or ask any questions. If anything, it's in the bourgeois camp where we can catch a timid glimpse at some reconsideration. Just a few months after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, an authoritative Italian newspaper reported, 1.5 million people run the risk of not surviving the winter, for lack of food and medicine throughout the Soviet Union. A report by the International Red Cross has stated 941 sometime later, still analyzing Yeltsin's Russia, a prominent political scientist, Maurice Duverger, pointed to the falling average life expectancy, whose responsibility fell on the privileged minority that had managed to accumulate enormous wealth through parasitical speculation though not explicitly illegal, and he denounced the true genocide of the elderly. 942 If not a reversal, at least the charge of genocide is applied to all sides, with the condemnation of one of the West's heroes, Yeltsin, and with him the West itself. Considered responsible for the tragedy that in no way took place in a situation of acute political and economic crisis, but after the Cold War itself had ended, at a time when, at least in the most advanced countries, shortages were only a distant memory. It comes to mind the summary made by Edgar Quinet regarding the French Revolution: the terror had been the first calamity, the second, that which ruined the Republic, was the trial conducted against the terror. 943.
Alright, that's all of chapter 7. It was only 14 pages. I think 8 is going to be like 30 pages again. Alright,